Morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this session of WAM, Haunting Stories. I'd like to pay my respects to the Wiradjuri people on whose land we are gathered, and pay tribute, please, to their elders, past, present, and emerging. And note that this is unceded land. My name is Jason Steger, and it's very nice to be back in Albury after a couple of years. As you know, we did the sessions online last year and also in 2020. Last year, one of the ones I was involved with was about historical fiction. Jock was in it as well. Also contributing in her inimitable way was Dottie Simmons, discussing her novel of Breath and Blood. And before we start, I just wanted to say how sad I was when I learnt that she had died. She was a wonderful supporter of WAM, and I was always grateful for her presence at sessions. You could always rely on her to get the questions from the audience started when we came to the end of the session. So it's sad that she's no longer with us. Today we have three guests who have written remarkable books that appropriately have a strong sense of place and a keen feeling for the trauma experienced by the characters and their communities. The Settlement is Jock's sixth novel and the final in a trilogy of historical novels set around the Furneaux Islands between the mainland and Tasmania. He won the ARA Historical Novel Prize for the second of them, The Burning Island, which was the one we were talking about this time last year, but not in person. But The Settlement is very different from the first two. It's a devastating picture of George Augustus Robinson, the so-called protector of Aborigines, and the Waibalena settlement on Flinders Island that he eventually came to supervise. It's an engrossing read, stark in its depiction of the conditions of Waibalena, brilliant in its portrayal of its cast of characters, and also in the portrayal of the consequences of the whole system. Now, Nardi Simpson is a Yuwalare woman. She's a musician and songwriter with the vocal duo Stiff Gins, and they're going to be doing a gig here at 2:15 this afternoon. So you should all be back for that. It's a free gig as well. Well, that makes a difference sometimes. She's a playwright, and The Song of the Crocodiles is her first. The Song of the Crocodile is her first novel. It was published in October 2020 and tells the story of four generations of an indigenous family. Actually, I think it was published in 2021, wasn't it?
2020.
2020, I got it right. Tells the story of three generations of an indigenous family, the Billy Mills, living in a small town called Darnmore. Just the name of it, conjures up all sorts of things. There's tension between the settler communities and the original inhabitants, sometimes overt, sometimes sublimated, and eventually, well, I probably better not say too much more, but it's a book about country, about really belonging, about resilience, hypocrisy, and the guiding spirits and customs of the indigenous people. And Eliza Jones, Henry Jones, has written 4 novels previously, and her latest is also a novel set on an island. And what is it about islands we've got going here? But hers is a very different kettle of fish. In Salt and Skin, a newly bereaved mother and her 2 children, she's a photographer, shift from Australia to the Orkneys off the northernmost coast of Scotland, where she will document climate change as a photojournalist. But what she finds is a society imbued with myth on an island that has also got a traumatic past. Please welcome our 3 writers. Now, we're talking about place and trauma, and I wondered if you could tell us about the very careful creations of setting in your novels and what you're doing with the place in which you set them. Where did I mean, with you two, they are real places, although heavily, well, yours has got a different name, but yours is Flinders Island. Nardi, yours is, it seems to be a fictional town. Can you tell us a bit more about it?
Darnmore?
Yeah, and what you wanted to do with Darnmore.
Darnmore, I thought, I want to make this place nowhere but everywhere.
Mm-hmm.
And the way I came about it, Darnmore's a made place. It's made, constructed and barricaded by this big levee. But, so it's a real focal point, a marker. But the story of Darnmore actually is out along the river because there's people living and being and relating and laughing, crying, as they have been since the river was drawn in the land, yeah. So there's this funny thing about focusing on, the wood and concrete and then maybe a bit of steel, is telling you one part of the story that is kind of in opposition to the landscape. It's funny, because we're looking, in the book, we're looking at this, the thing that's saying, here I am, which is telling you nothing about where you are. So that's what I want to do, really. Aboriginal communities living out along the river, and this is sort of mirrors my dad's family, my grandmother and grandfather, 11 kids. I was saying yesterday, actually, my dad's the middle of 11.
Wow.
So you got 5 either side, middle child, big time. And they lived along this place in Walgett called Monkila Bend. And there's 5, 6 other families there. And when they talk about this place, it was corrugated iron, and hessian and scraps. And when they talk about this place, it's like, it's like the White House, Buckingham Palace or something, I don't know. We had everything. This is true. We had everything we needed. And when we hear these as sort of, me and my cousins, think, no, you didn't have anything. In fact, you weren't allowed anything. Yeah, but we had everything, It was the best time of our life growing up along the river. And as a sort of urban, modern person, I get angry with them for saying that because I just see what they were denied. But I wrote this town, Darnmore, and the campgrounds because I wanted to see with their eyes what it was they had. And I wanted to feel it as part of my story. Instead of saying, you had nothing and you were denied, I wanted to feel what it was they did have. And through the construction of this place, I understood. And it made Darnmore even more ridiculous because the more resources the town had, the less they held. But these mob out on the river, they had their own family and other families either side that gave them everything that they needed. So that's why I made Darnmore, to travel through words to see what my dad saw and to feel the richness of what they had despite the lack of resource. Yeah.
Jock, Flinders Island, which I think you know very well.
I do.
But the Waibelina settlement is a place of great trauma. When you started the trilogy of Furneaux Island novels, were you always going to end up at this point?
Yes. Yeah, I was. And I think I dreaded it coming, in the sense that I had this concept for a long time in my head that there's 50 years in these islands which is really vital to understanding colonialism and understanding the frontier. From 1797, when the Sydney Cove was wrecked there, which led to the discovery by European Australians of Bass Strait. That's sort of the starting point of this frenzy of activity. And then the ending point is 1847, when they closed the settlement. So originally the idea was to write a novel about the 50 years. And then once I started preservation, I realised there's just so much more to talk about. And so I've stepped my way through the 50 years, but Waibelina was always looming as that end point. And it's a difficult thing to describe because it's a slow motion tragedy. It was open for 14 years, and it opened with this combination of greed and good intentions and bad intentions and complete indifference, and it just slowly sank into the ground. And when we talk about place, one of the real challenges here creatively was that I've spent a lot of time at the site of the ruins, and it's just paddocks and long grass, and there's little scatters of broken bricks and bits of old timber, and you can walk around and you know that it's trying to talk to you, this place. There are undoubtedly all of these human stories coming up out of the ground. But on the other hand, as a resource, George Augustus Robinson kept these enormous diaries, and there's thousands and thousands of pages of this stuff, and he's flat out justifying himself all the time. He knows he's writing to history and he's trying to give himself a good account. So you have, on the one hand, an overabundant source that literally won't shut up, and on the other hand, you have the ground that is sort of whispering at you, and it's very, very hard to hear. And somewhere between the two extremes is the story, and balancing those two sources was a really unusual storytelling experience, I think.
Yeah, because one character says in the book, "This place eats human lives," and that's it really did, didn't it?
Yeah, there's a graveyard there. So the two visible remains are that there's a chapel and a graveyard, and the graveyard is probably an acre of grass, and in one corner of it there's a kind of little right angle wall, and all of the conventional European style headstones are in there, and those are all the settler families. And the rest of that acre is bare grass, and there's hundreds of people under that ground, and there have been attempts along the way to put out markers or headstones, and they've been bulldozed back into the earth, and it seems like that piece of ground insistently remains silent about what went on. And there's both a need to be respectful of that, particularly as a white writer, but also I think there's a need to talk about what happened there and what went wrong and what we're still repeating on the basis of that.
Yeah. We might come back to you as a white writer writing Indigenous stories. Eliza, the Isle of Chennai. What took you there?
I went to a trip to the Orkney Islands in 2017, and we just happened to go to this kirk, and it's a very old kirk. They began construction on it in 1137. And in this kirk, there's a hole in the wall that used to operate as a dungeon during the 17th century witch hunts on these islands that are sort of off the north coast of mainland Scotland. And there's the hangman's ladder, and there's the manacles that they wore, these people. And, the people accused of witchcraft were overwhelmingly women on Orkney, even more so than the mainland. And I was really struck by the kirk, and I was struck by a few of the smaller islands around Orkney. So there was one little barren spit of land that you could see from mainland Orkney called Thieves' Home, and there's hardly anything written about it. But I think in the 1400s they used to leave people there just to die, basically. People accused of witchcraft and other crimes, and that really struck me. So I kind of fictionalised this little island, but the islands themselves are based quite heavily on Orkney.
Yeah, it's an extraordinary landscape up there, isn't it? I think, I was near there a few months ago, and it's extraordinary, sort of barren hills and craggy. And Nardi, in Song of the Crocodile, you're working. I was really interested in this. You're working on 3 levels, which you're working on the sort of the level that we're at the moment. Then the crocodile itself, Garia, is underground, but there's also a considerable chunk of the book set in the stars, I guess, and this is all a sort of a representation of something called burugu. Could you tell us about that? And because it allows you to follow characters after they have died, in effect. And it seems to me that it also allows you to talk about the indigenous spiritual life.
Burugu is our word for the dreaming. And the translation doesn't work. You know, some people call it the every when. I like that one because it sort of jumbles you up in how you think about time and gravity and all that stuff anyway. I think it's this kind of burugu is a non-tactile anchor, the fabric of movement and relationship actually, that allows fluidity and change and stability actually. So then writing a story about under the ground and in a star and breathing, walking people works when you allow the freedom of an every when or something. And it's not just a blackfella thing. I mean, we've got a lot of language and practice built around that sort of framework, which is really hard to. It's much easier to do than to explain.
Yeah.
Yeah. But it's a human. I mean, look, people make art and write books and have imaginations.
Yeah.
Even when 9 to 5, you know, your mind goes into burugu. So
It's a sort of, I mean, I think in the book, I can't, no, of course I won't be able to find it now, but it's described as a sort of connectedness, isn't it?
yeah.
Yeah.
And I think, you know, it's one of those beautiful things that there's a conceptual understanding, but also an understanding that resides in people, which is, I think, really beautiful, that you allow yourself to connect to others. Yeah.
And so was it a challenge to sort of wrangle all these different elements into the book, into a narrative, and at the same time deal with the trauma of the Indigenous people you write about, and particularly the trauma that the Billy Mills deal with?
It wasn't a challenge because, I mean, we're kind of we're superstitious type people. My family anyway, we always say, you know, it's the ones that are gone you got to worry about because they, you know, boss you around even worse when you can't see them. And we have that door open, you know. It's true. But this is why all these photos are freaking me out right now. You know, all these dudes looking around. And it's a way of keeping people alive and breathing to you. You allow them that space in your life. Anyway, so that kind of thing was not hard. And also, I think, to your question, the way to deal or compute with difficult things is to have that faith. That you have family who have your back, regardless of what happens here. So I think, you know, I never actually realised until you asked me there. It's that the strength of the untouchable is actually the thing that can help you get to the next sad moment.
Yeah, and there are a lot of sad moments, because the trauma you talk about is, I mean, it's historical, it encapsulates the indigenous population of Australia, full stop. But it's also very personal, isn't it? I mean, through, particularly, I thought, through the character of Paddy, who is the third generation of the Billy Mills with whom you deal with. Millie's son, he is conceived in a moment of sexual assault, and that trauma that she experiences is, and I'm not giving away too much, am I? No, I don't. That trauma runs through his entire life. Could you tell us a bit about him?
Yeah. So much to talk about anyway. When I there's personal reasons to kind of want to write somebody, so I don't mean to make him so damaged, you know? And then you kind of ask yourself, you know, what good is this doing? And asking people to engage with those things. Why do that? And I mean, when I could step back and try and construct an experience for a reader and an experience for a community that are seeing, reading, engaging with difficult things. What was really important to me, or a drive, I remember thinking to myself, you've got to keep, you know, I wanted to share the feeling or the experience of knowing what it felt like. This is a weird thing to say so early on a Sunday, I'm sorry. What it felt like to experience hit after hit after hit. And then baby born, hit after hit. And that was a driver for me, because I think putting that on a page and asking people and looking after people to read that gets us closer together. I think.
Yep, I can see
I
that.
hope.
Yep, I think you're right.
And when we're close, we see how similar we are. Yeah, so that's kind of the reason why I made poor old Paddy. And I want to give him context because he's a young black man and we see the violence that he perpetrates. But we don't think of how young black men get to that point. And it often goes past their own lived experience. And it can go to places like Dartmoor, where, you know, grandparents are kept away, and even though, you know, it's just the systems we put in place to kind of deal with the unknown come out in those explosions in kids and...
Because, I mean, certainly with Dartmoor, the town is, you know, there's a historical trauma inflicted by the settlers to establish the town. Isn't there? And I must admit, the first time I read the book, I thought I was paying more attention to the sort of overarching sense of trauma caused by the settlers. But then the second time I read it, I saw it much more as Paddy's the tragedy of Paddy Billy Mill, because he's a complex, deeply affected character.
Between the pages, hard story, you know, people say, Nardi, why so many characters die in your book? First of all, I say, I apologise, but actually that's, blackfellas read it and say, that's our life. But within the pages, intense, and hopefully, you know, hopeful and whatever, you know, everything we try and...
Well, there's a lot of love in the book. There's a huge amount of love.
Yeah. But I think what I've really tried to engage with is outside of the page. that this then sits alongside a whole lot of other beautiful stories and happy stories and kid stories, and the Song of the Crocodile goes into a real proper dreaming story about how a place was made. So, you know, the intensity of that story actually in that moment is one thing, but the context for a story like that sits in Burugu. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So the book, you know, I feel deadly I've written a book, but actually... and you can get away with feeling deadly that you're writing a book. But the story is not that. The story is this, you know, how we all weave in and how we all train. Yeah. Even these fellas here, you know, they're all part of it. Anyway.
Jock, so Jock, let me ask you about, you know, you're very careful in the book. You've got notes at the start, and writing about Indigenous characters is you know, this idea of, you know, cultural appropriation, etc., is a tricky area, tricky topic. So I just wondered about writing, for example, Managalena.
Yeah.
You know, the great Indigenous leader who features significantly in the book. I mean, how did you approach the whole subject?
Why did I do this? I think it's undoubtedly difficult, and I think the other important thing to say early on is I'm not sitting here saying I got it right. I don't know yet. I think that's a much longer conversation. But there are definitely areas in which I have no place at all as a writer, and I kept looking for them and trying to stay out of them. It is equally true that because the territory is difficult and because the conversations are complex, that's not a reason to not bother. I think that lots and lots of white writers sort of do this eye roll thing and they go, oh, I'm not going there, that's very difficult, I'll get in trouble. And no one's ever quite sure about who you get in trouble with or what the trouble is. But there's this whole thing of, oh, look, I might just write another outback town and stay away from it. And unless people try to grapple with it at some point, as settlers, as European Australians or whatever we are, then the conversation doesn't get had. And it's interesting, I talked a lot to Paul Daly, the journalist, during the writing of this book, and he is much more connected to First Nations journalism than I am. And he talks about how Aboriginal people every Australia Day have to re-explain why, you know, explain the hurt. And he said at some point, white writers have got to also talk about the hurt and talk about complicity. So I think there are reasons to do it as well as reasons to be extremely careful about what you do. And so there are the ordinary things here, you know, the ordinary politeness of asking Aboriginal people about what you're doing, making sure that you're talking to the right people, and showing people parts of the manuscript that may be sensitive. And I did all of those things. And
how did you go about that? I mean,
it's a very slow, kind of approximate, inexact process. You ring someone and they say, oh, you ought to talk to so-and-so, and you ring them and you're chasing emails around in circles. And I'm not a very methodical writer, but I keep a table of all of the emails where they went and who I've got to get back to. And
that sounds pretty methodical.
Oh, because it's the only methodical thing I do. But so there are all of those conversations, and then there's, I suppose, the reflecting on what you've written a number of times. So when I compare the early drafts to the draft that was published, my position on Managalena and on lots of First Nations things actually moved a lot. And the Tasmanian context is really different to the mainland context. The hope in the end is that you get to a point where you've told a part of the story about settlement and the frontier and complicity and guilt, and you've left a large part of the story that's there for First Nations people to tell in their own way. But as I say, whether that balance has been gotten right is other people's judgment, not mine.
And so have you had, well, the book's only been out 2 or 3 weeks. I mean, we haven't run our review of it yet.
The wires are fizzing.
Have you had feedback from what I would just Indigenous readers, people in Tasmania who you hadn't necessarily been in touch with and who have got back to you?
Yeah, only indirectly. There is the business of me needing to go back to the islands and talk about the book. And during the researching of the book, there was this great day when we flew over to Cape Barren Island, and I was travelling with a guy who had a bag of sausages that he'd made, and we put the sausages on the council barbie, and the islanders came and we had a meeting over these sausages and a discussion. So there needs to be another sausage meeting at some point. That moment is looming. But otherwise, no, not a lot. There really hasn't been. The book's very new and there hasn't been a lot of discussion at all.
Okay. Yeah. No. I'm sure there'll be lots of discussion. It's a very good book, by the way. Eliza, you have academic qualifications or ongoing interest in trauma, don't you? In climate change trauma, I think.
Yes.
And you're trained in trauma counselling. When you wrote the book, Salt and Skin, did you have to leave that behind? Did you have to try and distance yourself from an academic approach?
Oh, that's a good question. I don't know that I could sort of distance myself from the academic approach because I think studying, so my background's in psychology, grief, loss and trauma counselling. I worked in a drug rehab centre for a few years before I had my first book published, and I think it just so deeply informed my outlook, and I think being privy to so many people's stories just changed how I saw things, and that for me is all very much embedded with the theory, and that all informs my creative practice. So I don't know that I could step away. And also, Salt and Skin's part of my PhD, so I probably would have gotten in trouble if I had
Of course.
stepped away from the...
The trauma that is in Salt and Skin, I mean, there's different sorts of trauma. There's trauma of grief for Luda and her children because her husband, their father, has died. Oh, well, he's been killed in a car crash. There's the trauma on the island from the witches that still lingers. There's perhaps you could talk to us a bit about the witches.
The witches.
The witches that so intrigue Luda, and Luda is the mother of the two children. And when Luda arrives, she's a photojournalist and is going to be documenting climate change, the effect of climate change. But when she arrives, she takes a picture that sets off a train of events, and in which she becomes perhaps a modern day equivalent of those 17th century witches. Could you tell us about the witches?
The witches.
And the witches and what you want to do with their story. What you did with their story.
What I did with it. So I had never really given that much thought to the witch trials before I started working on Salt and Skin after I visited Orkney. And what really struck me is when you delve into the Kirk records and all of those sorts of things from that time, firstly, the records didn't really start until the 15th century, so there's a lot missing before that. And of what's there, women are so absent from the narrative, and often the trial records, where they were often convicted, condemned and then executed, were the most detailed surviving record of their day-to-day lives, so that really struck me. And in Salt and Skin, I grappled a lot with what I should draw from these very real stories and what I could twist to suit the narrative. And I think in my head I kind of conceptualised it as being informed by the landscape of the islands, informed by the history and the folklore, but the community is imagined. And I became very interested in the ways that that kind of mass collective trauma is perpetuated over time and how it's tied to place and the uneven way that we associate trauma with landscape. And, sorry, I'm a bit croaky. One thing that I found really striking when I went to the Orkney Islands was the site where they actually did these executions. So they'd be tried in the kirk, incarcerated in the kirk, in the little dungeon that had the floor shaped like a champagne bottle so they couldn't sleep. And they would then, if they were convicted, would then be marched, I think it was about 1.5 miles up the hill to a place called Galloha. And that was where they were executed. And when we were there, this place, it was just this little grassy patch in this suburban street where, you know, kids were playing and people were going about doing their shopping and, you know, and it just felt like a real microcosm of this much larger discussion about how we make sense of place and how we acknowledge trauma. And since then, I think they've put a little sundial there to honour the victims of the witch hunts. But yeah, I did find that very striking.
Did it speak to you, that place? Did you feel, you know, these vibes from it?
Very, very much. And what was funny was that I didn't know that I had any connection with Orkney or Scotland. And there's a lot of adoption and weird stuff in my family. And my mum gave me an Ancestry DNA kit for my birthday. And I've got this half-sister I've never met, and I was hoping I might meet her, but then my mum found a half-sibling she hadn't met, so I was like, you owe me another birthday present. But what emerged from that DNA test was that 50% of my DNA was sort of related to the Highlands and Orkneys.
Really?
And I was eyeball deep in my PhD in salt and skin by then, so that was kind of interesting. But yeah, the place, there's this term called absence-presence, and that just felt very relevant to understanding these sites of trauma, I think, and that the voices that haven't been recorded and the stories that aren't acknowledged, they still linger there, and they have a very kind of visceral presence, I think.
Absence-presence. It's quite good. I mean, that's sort of... Absence-presence is absolutely with the Song of the Crocodile, isn't it? And so did you have to... did you have to do research for Song of the Crocodile, or did you just have it, you know, you knew all the lore, you knew this already, and you had just family to talk to and...
Yeah, I made it up. But I knew it.
Yeah.
I mean, it's sort of like how do you get your feelings and how you move in the world down on the page. And once you start, then it has this beautiful life of its own. And so I really, you know, I enjoyed... maybe the thing that I was most kind of particular about was how I use language in the Yuwalari language. That was the thing that I was very kind of studied about, because I wanted to have the beauty of language without having to leaving the beauty of it and the openness of it there. So that was the thing that I kind of thought deeply about. Is how do you have the spirit of a spoken exchange thing written down, so somebody who has no concept of that idea can find themselves in it. That was fun.
Oh, you succeed though completely, because it's you don't read it and feel that you're being distanced from the book. You know, you in the same way that well, last year Anita Heiss was a guest, and in the same way that her book, which I will not attempt to pronounce the title of, but River of Dreams, in the same way that she does it there, in that use of language, but without distancing the reader. I think.
Well, you can do the same with English, eh?
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
I've read a few of those books too, like in English, and I taught that one. Yeah, I mean, and this is the beautiful thing about, you think you're making something, you think it's all you, but actually it's waiting for you in really interesting ways, Language is, my use of Uluru language was teaching me while I was doing it. Even though I thought I was choosing the bits to put where, I was still having relationship with it. And, it's sort of like when you were talking, Jock, about, how do you approach these things that we talk about the finished product, but the scope of what it is in a much larger context. And, the more you can bring all the sort of swirling yarns to it, like that beautiful DNA test. Is that the right way to say it? Do you know what I mean? It's like that story was there and it was waiting for you. This is how I interpreted it. And that place was waiting for you. Yet you made it. Yet it was always there. All those things. The context of story, I think, is much more than, what we think we're doing.
Yeah.
I was thinking about this the other day. I was asked to write a little thing about endings, and it suddenly occurred to me, I don't know why I hadn't thought of this earlier, but the story is still going, but you simply choose to stop telling it to the reader at some point. And it's like getting off a moving tram.
Yeah.
It's like there is no tram stop, but at some point you've got to get off this thing.
Yeah. And how beautiful, like that's making me think. There's a beautiful teacher, Elder Uncle Max Harrison, and he talks about culture, this relates. He says, you've got to give it away to keep it. And when I heard that, I thought, no, Unc, don't do that, because someone else will take ownership of it. But he said it, until the day he died, you've got to give it away to keep it. That means it's bigger than all of us. And we actually all need to feed that, to understand its power. I think about story like that, We focus on getting that story out at that time, but you must see, this is what I'm telling myself, you must see it in a much larger context of other writers and other places and other stories and the narrative of who we are and how we navigate all that stuff. Tangent, sorry.
Jock, what's your view of George Augustus Robinson now? I mean, he's a very...
It's not a lofty one.
I mean, did you read all his journals? Or
Yes, I did. Yeah, so there's, just to sort of put this in context, Robinson kept diaries of every single thing he did for years and years and years. And the two main areas of his activity that I was interested in were his walking in Tasmania to negotiate with First Nations people about surrendering, and then of his time as the commandant of the Wabalena settlement, which was about 4 years. So a historian called Plomley took all of this enormous mass of messy handwriting during the 60s and the 70s and the 80s, and he transcribed them and made these enormous volumes called Friendly Mission and Weep in Silence. And so I was mostly researching and writing during COVID, so I was never able to get to the Mitchell Library and look at the manuscripts. And it probably wouldn't have helped me much anyway, because apparently they're just illegible, but somehow Plomley figured them out. So I had read both volumes, and what really struck me about the other reading you can do about Robinson is that historians are really divided about him, that there are people who will maintain that he was a well-intentioned missionary who was up against it and did his best, and then there are people who will maintain that he's responsible for genocide. And it struck me that it's sort of impossible that he could be both of these things, and yet I think he might be. Like all of us, anyone who lives a reasonably long life will move through shades of character. And Robinson started out extremely idealistic. He was extremely tough and brave. He was a really odd guy. He was very devout. And then he started going about this work of his, and he saw it, and I use this term carefully, he saw it as successful in that he was negotiating peaceful surrenders and bringing people in from the bush. And he started to become more and more enamoured about his own brilliance and, you know, reading his own press, as we would say. And he became very greedy for money. He became very authoritative. And by the time he had left Flinders Island, he went and did similar work in Victoria, much less effectively. Again, effectively, what's that? And he then went to Europe with the aim of selling his memoirs. And the memoir never happened. But he had invested well, he became extremely wealthy, he was financially very, very mean, and he sort of did the lecture circuit in Europe in his later years and died in England and appeared to be a very bitter, unhappy man. So somehow he had passed through all of these different ways of being, and any given historian, any given fiction writer can open the window at one point or another and see a different person, I think. He's an enigma. There's no getting to the bottom of him.
I mean, I did wonder in the book, there's a mysterious black dog who appears on the island and seems to be popping up like a sort of Zelig character.
Yes.
And I just wondered, did that black dog come to symbolise some sort of conscience?
I think that's exactly what it was to me, but I think people will find their own black dog. The story behind the black dog was that somewhere in these mountains of stuff that Robinson wrote, there's this tiny little passing mention that he had been speaking to somebody who had received a letter about a shipwreck over on King Island. So if you think of Bass Strait, Tasmania is sort of in inverted commas, and the western one, I don't know which way I'm facing, but the western one is King Island, which is a big island that sits by itself. The eastern ones are a group of 50 to 100 islands, depending how you define an island, called the Furneaux Group, and Flinders is the big one in the Furneaux Group. This ship called the Neve had struck King Island in the west and sank, and lots of people died, and this letter that was mentioned by someone to someone else that Robinson wrote down says that a black dog got onto a piece of the wreckage and drifted across Bass Strait and landed successfully on Flinders Island and just walked ashore. So that's about 250 kilometres on a westerly on this piece of wood. And I love the idea that this happened. We'll never know whether it did or not. But anyway, it's one of those things you find in research, and it's just too good to leave there. You bend the book to fit it. And the black dog turns up a lot when people are faced with their own consequences. And Robinson in particular, there are 2 points in the book where he kicks the dog and he is enraged to find that the dog doesn't really react. And then later on he puts a collar on the dog, and next time the dog reappears, the collar's gone. And to me, that's Robinson trying to collar his own conscience, which of course you just can't do.
No. Conscience. Eliza, there's a character in the book called Theo Finn. What are you doing with him? He is a character who is like the black dog in a sense, washed up on the island, and the way people react to him, he becomes a sort of cipher, doesn't he? For where does he come from in you? Not literally, where does he come from in the narrative, but in the creative mind, your creative mind.
My creative mind. So Theo is this child that inexplicably washes up on this little island, and he has no memory of where he's been, and he has webbed fingers, and the community's kind of divided. No one really knows where he's come from, and later on in the book, a mainland journalist comes to the islands to try and get to the bottom of it. And part of it came from wanting to contrast another character's trauma. So another character is very viscerally haunted by the trauma that he experienced as a child. And then you have Theo, who has no idea whether he's experienced trauma or not, really, because there's nothing. There's just these vague sensations of green and blue and being carried. But there's nothing that he can really anchor into story. And I guess I was sort of fascinated by the different ways that trauma can be wordless and the different ways that it can haunt through going back, absence, presence, but the different ways that it can haunt through its presence and through its absence. But I was also interested, I think, in how Selkie folklore, so Selkie's folklore is very much associated with the Northern Isles of Scotland and Ireland, and it's basically generally women would emerge onto the beaches and shed their seal skin and they'd dance, and there's a real gentleness to the Selkie tales that's missing in some of the other sort of oceanic folklore, like the kraken and sirens. There's that kind of real vein of violence there. And I think I just became very interested in those folk tales when I was quite young. And here we are.
And here we are, yes. And so before we go to questions from the audience, I just wondered, writing these books, which are dealing with trauma in all sorts of different ways, how did that impact on you as writers, tackling these subjects? Did you come away changed by the experience of writing the book?
Should I? What's the right answer? I didn't.
Is that because you've lived with it all your life, do you think?
Well, I'm lucky. I haven't experienced things like that, but it's in my wheelhouse. And I think the best way to answer that question is that there was a real responsibility in making the writing of those types of things worth it for everybody. That's probably what I felt, that, what's the good in that, Nardi? I had to answer that. I had to have an answer for that. Why? How is this going to help? And, it's just a story and it probably doesn't. But I think the thing that I will move forward with after writing a story like that is, and it's, my family make me this way. You've got to look after people. You know what I mean? So showing care and kindness in the writing of a story that's difficult, to anyone who will get swept up in that, is the right way for me to be. And if there is kindness and care that comes out of hard stories, then it's probably the right way for me to write too.
Yeah. Was it difficult for you writing
Yeah,
this
it was. And a bit like Nardi's just said, I've had a very fortunate, privileged life, and very few bad things have happened to me. And so when you are examining other people's trauma, there's an exercise in empathy that you've got to engage in. And once you've written however many drafts this book was, but it was lots of drafts, you start to become desensitised to the things in it that really hurt. But the first time you encounter them, they hurt like hell. And I think it's a legitimate barometer of how the book is going to affect a reader if you pay close attention to that first reaction. When you discover something in the research, or when you create a form of words around a thing and it hurts, you get emotional about it, and that's a really good measure of how it's ultimately going to work for the reader. But you then pass through these other drafts where you're not noticing it so much. But I felt at times, it's a combination of being locked down and taking on a heavy subject and lots of things, but I had that sense at times that people talk about, that if you go to rescue a drowning swimmer, they climb on top of you and they're almost trying to shove you under in the process. And there were months when I felt like this story was trying to drown me, and it was almost a relief to get out the other end of it, which I think tells you something about the story and not about me.
Yeah. What about you, Eliza?
I think in some ways, when you're the one writing the trauma, in some ways it becomes muted, but in other ways it becomes a lot more vivid because you're immersed in that world for so long. For Salt and Skin, it was nearly 4 years of being immersed in that world. And I think in some ways I'm good at approaching trauma now in a way in my work that doesn't take a huge toll on me. I mean,
You've been counselling and stuff.
Yeah. Since I've been sort of sitting alongside it since I was 18 in various ways professionally. And I think for me, the way that I manage it is to create a context in the story that does have warmth in it and love and levity. I don't think I would be able to immerse myself in the same way if the story was just desolate and unrelentingly dark.
Yeah.
And I think it actually works. I think it helps portray trauma accurately because trauma does exist in this whole complex tapestry, this constellation of other events and other feelings. And I think the juxtaposition of that levity and that lightness with the really dark and the challenging lends weight to both elements in a story.
Great. Well, now we should take some questions from the audience if we can. If you have a question,
Thank you.
Could you put your hand up and there's one over there.
Oh, thank you. You've really unpacked haunting for me quite a lot. I think I'm still back in last night, and I'm thinking about sound and music and haunting, and how what sound teaches us about haunting. And I wonder if that's something that comes up in any of your work.
Sound became really key for me when I was working on Salt and Skin. Part of my fascination with it stemmed from this Irish Orcadian researcher who became really preoccupied with giving the sounds of these women's homes back to them. So she went out to all these quite remote islands around Orkney where a lot of the women executed came from, and she went into the dungeon and she played these recordings of the wind and the ocean and the birds. And that was a pretty big part for me in how I inhabited that space, particularly in lockdown. I couldn't even make my way to Port Phillip Bay and have a little paddle in the water, so just it became very vital in how I inhabited that space creatively.
Well, you know.
Sound and haunting? I missed last night. What happened? Sorry.
Pies got beaten.
There was a band and stories relating to particular songs and.
Ooh, no wonder you're still thinking about it. I don't know. That's beautiful. You're making me think. Because what is it? It's a sensory thing, and we're so eyes, however you say that, And so that music, sound takes you... It's actually a physical thing. I find sound very physical, It affects, which is a beautiful juxtaposition to this. And that, that going somewhere. So, I don't know, Song of the Crocodile.
There's a line in the settlement where, and I can't remember who actually. I can't remember who says it, but the music of their laughter was gone. In its place was coughing. So that's the real, the change of the sound at Waibalena.
And again, Robinson makes so many admissions against his own interest, but one of them is how much coughing is going on. And what was killing Aboriginal people at Waibalena was principally respiratory diseases. But I think my way of answering that question would be that this was a really silent novel. And I've written other novels where I've had playlists and lyrics that I've worked in, and this was utter silence, which is an eerie thing. There is somewhere online you can find Manalagena's daughter was a woman whose traditional name, I can't remember, but she was known as Fanny Cochrane-Smith. And Fanny Cochrane-Smith, very late in her life, somebody got her to sing language into a recording. And the way the recording was done at that stage in history was, it was like a box with that enormous sort of seashell horn on it. And she'd been dressed up in European clothes, and she's standing very dignified in this black and white photograph. And for some inexplicable reason, there's a tree fern next to her. But she's singing into this horn. And there's a white man standing next to her, presumably conducting this exercise in some way. But it's a very, very poignant image because she maintains her dignity. She's dressed in these sort of superimposed clothes, and the white person doing it knows that what they're doing is trying to capture something that's rapidly vanishing. And that, to me, is an image of sound, although it's not a sound. Yeah.
That recording's online.
Yes, yeah.
National Film Sound Archive.
Yeah, it's beautiful. And the photograph's amazing.
Okay, we've probably got time for one more very quick question. Yep.
It's quite cosy with the rain.
It's lovely.
Hi. All of you mentioned place, but you also mentioned people. And I know that no one ever just goes, I'm going to go write this story, and then looks for both of those things. It's often that you stumble upon one or the other. When you look for stories, are you looking for places to speak to you, or people? Or is it that they're so intertwined that you don't get a choice and both have to be written in?
Places and people intertwined. That's in effect your question, isn't it?
For me, it's neither. I'm looking for images, and so really, if you look at a novel like The Settlement, it's a series of images that struck me forcefully, like the dog stepping off the wreckage, or like the way that the settlement would have looked. And I'm trying to link them with narratives. So sometimes the images are images of people in distress, or people in whatever state, and sometimes they're images of places, but it's a set of things that I can see clearly, and the rest of it's murky, and I'm trying to link them together. That's a real non-answer, isn't it? Sorry about that.
I'm the opposite. I think those things are the same. I think people are place. Blackfellow Way, we acknowledge country, you know, we're actually saying, I see you. That's how I understand. And, you know, I'm in Albury saying Uluru, I'm in Ualarai. There's a bit of Lightning Ridge right here. That's how I see it. So, you know, it's really interesting. How can you can't disconnect those things, and we're all our own little island walking around. How deadly is that? Hey.
I think for me, I see human and place similarly as being very, very enmeshed, and that's particularly true in the context of exploring climate change and history, and the way that this climate change is sort of damaging people and damaging place and damaging animals, and the way everything's kind of interacting. So I think working on this novel's really broken down those kind of boundaries for me.
Is that what the rockfall represents? Are we supposed to think of the rockfall in those terms?
I don't know.
That's what it did for me. It was like an ominous warning that the land is collapsing.
Yeah.
Yes, that was completely intentional. Yeah.
Okay, now, ladies and gentlemen, I think we've gone over time. So before we thank our guests, can I just make mention of the fact that Nardi will be back at 2:15 here. They were supposed to be playing, the Stiff Gins were supposed to be playing in the Botanic Gardens, but given the sounds going on outside, it's a good job that they're not now. Jock's going to be back here at 1 o'clock talking about Shades of Noir with Margaret Hickey and T.R. Napper. And after Stiff Gins have played, I'm back here at 3 o'clock with Michelle de Kretzer. So until then, please thank Nardi Simpson, Jock Serong and Eliza Henry Jones.